From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Mark Harwitz. I'm a music specialist in the music division at the Library of Congress, and I'm currently the archivist for the Leonard Bernstein collection, but with me is, among other things, the previous archivist for the Bernstein collection, Charlie Harmon. And thank you for coming.
You're very welcome.
And I just wanted to start with some information about you. What was your background, your educational experience before you became involved in all of this?
Yeah, I have a degree in music composition from Carnegie Mellon. I graduated in 1973. I had gone to Carnegie Mellon in architecture. Really couldn't get my brain around the profession of architecture. It's really hard. Music was a lot easier, and the important thing in the 60s was the late 60s was to stay in school and not be drafted. So I dropped into the music department, which was one floor down at Carnegie Mellon at that point. So when as a grown-up, I was a computer operator for a little company in Boston, and a friend, one of my roommates from Carnegie Mellon, was living in New York doing his postdoctoral research at the Rockefeller University, and he said, "You need to move to New York because the opportunities are here." And I did, and I worked at a company called Tams Whitmark, which licenses Broadway material. I liked it very much. It paid very well. And I met Dale Kugel, who became a mentor to me. It was the first time I'd thought of someone as a real mentor. And he wanted to hire me to be his copyist assistant librarian. And that wasn't in the cards. So I was looking at the classified section every Sunday in the New York Times. Back when it was 100 pages every week, it was pretty impressive. And there was always something under music in the New York Times, even though obviously to get into the music business in New York, you had to know somebody. It was all about who knew, new talent that was in the city. But there was this one ad that said, "Musician, world class, needs assistant, must be free to travel, familiar with European languages, super organized." It didn't say super, but it had to be very well organized, and be able to read music. And that was it. And then a box so you could send your resume. And I thought, I've lived overseas when my father was in the army. We lived in Germany and Italy. I could still read German and Italian, but at that point I had let it lapse and I couldn't really have a conversation. I could certainly read music. I was very organized. Everything. I've always, when I receive letters, I file them in boxes. It's just what I do. I just organize stuff. All my books and music were always alphabetized. So I sent off my resume, which was about this long, and I got a call, and it was from Mimsy Gill, who was secretary to someone named Harry Kraut. Not a clue who the world-class musician was, and they asked me to come in for an interview. And the interview went on for 3 hours.
Just with Harry? Just
with Harry. First thing he said was, "It's Leonard Bernstein." And I said, "Oh." Let me think, Leonard Bernstein. I'd never seen Bernstein conduct, except on young people's concerts. I hadn't read any of his books. I had 2 recordings that I liked, the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, and Robert Schumann Symphony Number 3. And what I remember sitting there talking to Harry and thinking of that Robert Schumann recording, and the cover had the Cathedral of Cologne and a portrait of Leonard Bernstein, and they were the same size. And I remember sitting there thinking, yeah, okay, Leonard Bernstein has an ego as big as the Cathedral of Cologne. Harry didn't tell me much more than that. So I prodded him and I said, this was in October of 1981, and I said, what's the schedule in 1982? You know, what's he doing in 1982? And Harry talked for 45 minutes without pause, without any notes, a week-by-week summary of what the maestro was doing in 1982. And at the end of 45 minutes, I was stunned. I mean, he began by, he would mention the orchestras and where we would be and where, if an orchestra was being taken on tour. And at that point, I had crossed the Atlantic 6 times in my life, and I was 31 years old. And in the first 6 months, there were about 8 crossings of the Atlantic, and I thought, this is just insane. This is an insane schedule. So after the 45 minutes, I said, I think you need a very high energy person for this job, and I've never been high energy. And I said, I think you need someone about half my age. And Harry let me talk about myself for a while. And one of the things I was doing, I shared an apartment in Brooklyn Heights, and I and my neighbors had decided to have a New Year's Eve party. We just decided we were happy in New York, and we were going to invite all our friends. We, I think, invited 250 people, and they all showed up. And we decided to cater it ourselves. And so what I did was I made all the cookies, and I made 80 dozen cookies. And Harry said, "Oh yeah, party for 200 people. I know exactly the caterer I would call." And I said, "Well, we don't have that kind of budget." So I made 80 dozen cookies, and Harry was completely taken aback. He'd never met anybody who would just nonchalantly turn out 80 dozen cookies and throw a party. I mean,
I still haven't.
It's not hard to do, because once you start baking, it's just you just have to have the space to let them cool and then the tins to put them in. He was wildly impressed. He told me this later, after I was hired. He said the 2 things that really impressed him was the 80 dozen cookies, and that at the bottom of my resume, I had listed the 3 high schools that I went to. And the first one was in Naples, Italy, run by the U.S. Navy. And he'd never met anyone who went to high school in Naples. And he thought, this is exactly the person.
Do you have any idea how many people they actually interviewed for the job?
Well, he told me, this was years later, he told me that they usually got 200 responses, and they would throw out 190 of them, because they ran the ad in the Times and the Village Voice. And you can imagine the responses they got from the ad in the Village Voice, especially since it didn't say who it was. It just said world-class musician. Well, what, Bob Dylan? Who is it? And he said they knew instantly which applications to throw out. But he liked what I had listed, the degree in composition, the languages, the ability to travel, well, he didn't know how organized I was. So when I left the interview, I said, I don't think I can do this. And I left, and I had some other interviews that fall. I can't remember now what they were. And I think around Thanksgiving, I called, it was the Amberson office at that point, and I called the office and talked to Mimsy Gil, Harry's secretary, and said, look, just keep my name in the mix. I'm sure you're still having interviews. Well, they weren't. And just let me know, if something falls into place. So the first working day after New Year's in 1982, Harry called me at TAMS and said, you can have it. We're going to hire you. You have to fly to Bloomington, Indiana this Friday. This was a Tuesday. And you'll meet Lenny in Bloomington. And I said, I can't talk on the phone because personal calls were not allowed at TAMS Memorial. I said, I'll come to your office this evening. And when I walked into the Amberson offices, Harry was on the phone with the student union in Bloomington making my accommodation reservation. And I said, well, if you really think I can do it, okay, I'll do it. We hadn't talked about a salary or anything like that.
And it didn't need Lenny's approval, the hiring of you.
Lenny trusted Harry with a lot of those details.
Was Jack Gottlieb the person before you, or was there somebody
No,
in between?
Darrell Bernstein came before me, and I don't know why he I can't remember how long he stuck with it. But I think it was less than 2 years. And there was an interim assistant, Richard Nelson, wonderful actor. He's out in L.A. And I don't remember how he came into the picture, but he was doing some travel with Bernstein and I think maybe helping out Darrell for a while. Before Darrell, there was a string of assistants. Lenny told me at one point, well, one of them lasted for only 4 days. He'd show up, someone would show up, see how overwhelming the position was, and then just leave.
What was your title?
Assistant to Leonard Bernstein. But I never had a business card or anything like that. There wasn't anything.
And in addition to your salary, they covered all your travel costs and hotels.
Right, and when I talked to Harry about salary, I had never bartered for a salary in my life. Harry offered, he asked me how much I was being paid at TAMS, and I told him I was way too honest. And he offered about, it was about 20% more. And I didn't know what to do, so there was a pause, and Harry assumed that I agreed. And it really should have been about 3 times what he offered me. It wasn't really enough to live on in New York. I mean, I was really scrambling. And New York was cheap in 1981. I mean, relatively cheap. But, I mean, for $1, you could get a newspaper and get on the subway. It was.
Were you able to negotiate raises?
No, and that was something, I just didn't have it in me. And there were times when, over the 4 years of being the assistant, that I would ask Harry, I really need to be paid more for, working 80 hours a week. And he said, it'll just put you in a higher tax bracket. And I
So you worked for
didn't
Lenny
argue.
for 4 years in this position.
So I flew out to Indiana that Friday with Harry. Harry said he'd tell me everything I needed to know on the flight. He promptly fell asleep. Didn't, no conversation at all on the flight. And I still hadn't met Bernstein. And it wasn't until the next day in Indiana that Bernstein arrived, and I met him. And I thought, this derelict, this decrepit geriatric who was drunk, he hadn't slept, he hadn't shaved that day, he obviously had not showered. And I thought he was nuts. I thought he was completely nuts. He was very lively, but after at this condo outside of Bloomington, after he arrived with this barrage of university people behind him, and Richard Nelson and Harry and Stephen Wadsworth Zinser, who was collaborating on what turned into A Quiet Place, and Ann Dedman, who was the chef, and also sort of a traveling household manager. So all these people arrived, and I mean, I wasn't even introduced to him. Harry said my name, and Bernstein, he couldn't really focus. He was just manic at that moment. So he had this huge parka. I took the parka off his shoulders and hung it up, and I asked him if he wanted a drink, and he said, "Well, what are you drinking?" And I had poured about a tablespoon of gin into a glass because I thought I might need it. My nerves were a little up at that point, and he grabbed the glass out of my hand and drank it. And I said, "That's my drink." And he said, "You don't talk that way to the Rebbe." And I didn't know what to do. I mean, I didn't think he was a rabbi, and I thought he was really angry. I thought he was, I wasn't so fine, and maybe I was fired already. And I just kind of stood around, mopey. He was talking to everybody else individually, all these people that he obviously knew. And after about a half hour, he said, "Well, I want to see the bedroom," because the piano there was an upstairs with a huge master suite. There was a desk in there, and there was a piano, and it overlooked. There was a wall of windows that overlooked Lake Monroe. It was frozen, of course, in January. It was a nice room, but that's basically where he was going to sleep and work for 6 weeks. And my concern was, is this a workable space? Can you write an opera here? And instead, he wanted to see how I had unpacked. I mean, the luggage came from New York, and I unpacked underwear for someone I'd never met.
So his
And I thought
personal
this was
assistant, it
peculiar.
wasn't just musical things, it was
It
everything.
was picking up the laundry, it was answering the phone. But Harry did say that I was hired because there was a deadline for this opera, a 3-part commission from Houston Grand Opera, La Scala, and the Kennedy Center. And the premiere was June 17th, 1983. So the opera had to be done on time. And I said, well, fine, June, at this interview in October of 81, I said, June of 83, that's plenty of time. Well, I didn't know what
Did
was
you ever
going
have
to
to
get
sort
in
of
the way.
corral Bernstein and say, you need to work now, or try and...
No, he also was super organized, and he understood what, at that point in his life, certainly understood how a collaboration would work. I think Steve Wadsworth had to corral Bernstein quite a bit, especially once they got some momentum going. Lenny would just find other things to do. His social calendar, for instance, that would just take over in New York, and Stephen would call and say, well, I really need to see him 3 times this week, and I need 2 hours on this day, and I need 2 hours on this day, and that was part of my job, to make sure that those meetings actually happened, and then they wouldn't be interrupted. If Adolph Green called in the middle of one of those sessions that the 2 collaborators were having, I would just take a message, or I'd talk to Adolph for an hour. That was always nice.
In the 4 years you were with Lenny, what were the major projects that happened? A Quiet Place. What other works did he work on?
Well, A Quiet Place was really it. There wasn't that much music. I think he was a little disappointed how he didn't have the time in those years to collaborate more. He did write arias and barcarolles, but that was completely on his own, and some little pieces. But other than A Quiet Place, there was nothing major.
So he was mostly conducting.
Yeah, it was a lot of conducting. He finished a Brahms cycle with the Vienna Philharmonic and a Schumann cycle, and then started a new Mahler cycle for Deutsche Grammophon, which didn't get completed. The eighth never got re-recorded. He did an all-American album in 1982, and he did an English album. It was an enormous amount of recording, and that actually took a lot of attention. I mean, when he looked at the Elgar Enigma variations in the spring of 1982, I remember looking through his score and thinking, well, there's nothing more he needs to mark in this piece. And then he looked at it as though he'd never looked at it before, and changed all kinds of things. Not so much change, but not changing dynamics, for instance, but adding articulation so that everything would be there in the parts, and he wouldn't have to explain so much from the podium. Of course, when you're conducting an English orchestra in a piece by Elgar, there's already a tradition that orchestra brings to it. But he really put his own
So somebody
stamp
would
on
actually go to the musician's parts and mark them up based on his annotations on the full scores?
Yeah, I ended up doing that.
Is that typical, or?
Yes, absolutely. That's what orchestra librarians do constantly. And the great thing about the job for me was that wherever we would go, usually there wasn't enough advance time to go to Larry Tarlow at the Philharmonic and say, here are all these markings, transfer them into the parts. But since we were traveling with Bernstein's own set of materials, it was the first time I'd met a conductor who had his own library. Basically, his performance library came from the New York Philharmonic. When he left the Philharmonic, what year was that, 73, I think? Carlos Mosley hadn't really promised, but somehow said to Bernstein, well, you can take anything from the library that you conducted at the Philharmonic. And so Bernstein took everything. I mean, all the Beethoven symphonies, all the Mozart and Haydn, Stravinsky, everything. And he just took everything.
His already marked up scores.
Right, scores and parts.
Were they horrified, or?
Well, it was a big loss, but, things got replaced. But there were some things he should not have taken, but he did. Toscanini's set of parts for the Leonore No. 3 overture of Beethoven, in which Toscanini changed the orchestration on the last page of the score, added brass, just revoiced chords and things like that in red pencil. I mean, it's Toscanini's markings in that score, and so they're in the parts, and that became Bernstein's set of materials. All that stuff, it was all stamped on the front, property of the New York Philharmonic Symphony Association, or whatever they used to call themselves. All that stuff went back to the Philharmonic Archive. When I became Bernstein's archivist and cataloged everything that was, that existed at that point. Barbara Hawes had created an archive for the New York Philharmonic, and she said, we think we would like this stuff returned.
Did he do the Norton Lectures while you were with him? Or
No, that was 72, I think. So it was 10 years. 72,
so there were no major lecture series, talkings, anything like that during the time you were with him?
There really wasn't. It was an enormous amount of conducting. And then that first year, we were on the road from Bloomington all the way through the end of September. There was really no pause. Sometimes we would be in Los Angeles. We were in Los Angeles for about a month that summer. But there was something every single day. And then after September, he had 9 empty months in which he was supposed to write the opera. So he started it in Bloomington. They got the first act basically done, not orchestrated. He wrote in a short score, so it was somewhere between 4 and 6 staves of music. And one of the first things he asked me to do, I was picking up his laundry in that room with the piano and the desk and the bed. He said, "Don't you have a degree in composition? Why are you picking up my laundry?" And I said, "Well, you know, laundry has to be picked up." And he said, "Well, here, see what you can do with this. I need a piano reduction." And he handed me the scene that he had finished the night before. And one of the things that the Indiana University Jacobs School of Music, I have to remember to say that, offered to do was a read-through of each scene as it was completed. And Stephen Wadsworth choralled a bunch of singers, some really marvelous singers, and some pianists, and it got taped, audio tape, scene by scene, but they needed something to play from, and they were not going to be able to play from a Leonard Bernstein manuscript and short score. So I started making a piano reduction, and it's something I've always enjoyed doing. In fact, I used to do it as an undergraduate. I would do it just for fun, just for myself. It was a great way to learn to read a score and to see what was important. And it also improved my music copying skills. And I did the entire first act.
Was he impressed?
No. He said, "You need to be more forceful on the page." I said, "I'm just trying to be accurate." And he said, "No, there's more to it than just being accurate." And then he would change things. It was really interesting because, I'd present him with a piano reduction, everything lined up, all the lyrics, just as clear as could be, always giving enough horizontal space for all the lyrics, and the vocal lines always in the same order. I mean, all that stuff is important. And then if he made a change, and he really looked at every single note that I had copied and my piano reduction. He liked that I made it playable, but he was very generous with his praise. But he did say there has to be more presence on the page. I was just using Alpheus Music Writer pencils, but he wanted me to press into the paper a lot more. And I was using a ruler, which helped, but it just had to be. It just had to look more forceful.
Did this experience change your relationship? Did he sort of start thinking of you in a different way?
I don't know how well, the working relationship at the beginning I just thought was kind of odd, because I didn't know anything about him. I didn't know that he smoked cigarettes. I didn't know he had been married and had kids. And I remember one day somebody named Alexander called, and I said, "Well, I'll take a message." And Lenny screamed at me. He said, "That's my son. Don't you know anything?" And I didn't know you had a son. So after that, when Alexander called, I said, "Here's your son on the phone." But I didn't know that.
Did you call him Lenny?
No, I never called him Lenny until after he died. I always called him Maestro or LB.
And he never encouraged you to...
No, and it's funny because when I worked for Loren Mazel as a freelance editor, he liked to be called Loren. But, talk about a grand personality. The opposite of Bernstein. But I also...
Which one was grand?
Oh, Loren Mazel.
Really?
But he liked to be called Loren.
Huh.
He liked to be on a first-name basis with everybody. Yeah, it was... he's very different from Bernstein, that's for
One
sure.
thing, it had never occurred to me when you were talking about the conducting, it seemed most of it was focused on recording, and I'd sort of assumed it was mostly focused on concerts for audiences, and that's...
Well, but all his recordings were live. They were all
So there were no studio recordings
No,
made?
well, the West Side Story album with Tecanoa and Jose Carreras.
Were you there
and Tatiana.
for that?
Yes, and actually that had an unforeseen benefit. It was kind of a disaster. I mean, it wasn't, Carreras was not the tenor that Bernstein had requested. I guess, was it Neil Rosenshine? I can't remember who was the tenor. Wasn't available. And so a little committee was put together. And I was not involved in this at all. And they had to find a tenor. And they latched onto Carreras, who said yes. But nobody sent him any music. And then his luggage went somewhere else. So he arrived in New York completely unprepared and kind of upset that he had no clothes. Meanwhile, I was a little concerned about the music copying because it was the original materials being used for this recording. And the editorial crew that was put together wanted to come meet with Bernstein and talk about the discrepancies they found. And I think they said they found 1,500 errors in the parts and another 1,500 in the score. And what Bernstein did, they came to the Dakota and I showed them into the study. Bernstein put some ice and some glasses and Valentines on the ice and handed each of the guys a drink, and then he talked and he wouldn't let them ask any questions. So nothing got fixed. And it was a mess. It was really, really a mess. And he, at one point in that film by Humphrey Burton of the making of this recording, he turns around and he chews out the editorial crew, and there was nothing that they could do. He wouldn't answer their questions. I read a book. I sat in the back and read a book. It was an awful 3 days. It was really no fun. But the good thing about that is that Candide was going to be the next project, which we did with the London Symphony in '89, actually almost a year before Bernstein died. And Bernstein said, well, there needs to be just one person in charge of putting, the music together. And he said, Charlie has to do it. So I did. Harry was very skeptical that I could handle that. And it took me about 6 months. I worked with the Hershey K orchestration pages that are now here at the library. Because that was all that existed. I didn't so much erase anything, except if Hershey K had written, say, the second violins doubled the second clarinet. For a while, he just would write Cole clarinet 2. So I would erase that and write the notes in, because what I had to give, and there were no lyrics in the Hershey K orchestration pages. So I put in all the lyrics, I made the dynamics match up and down, and occasionally there would be just a blank bar, and I figured Hershey K had gone to get a sandwich or something and come back and forgotten, the tuba would just be, the first part of the page, the tuba would be playing, and then it would be blank. And it obviously was supposed to play. And the harp in Bon Voyage plays for the first 4 bars and then is tacit for something like 390 bars. And I forgot to bring that up with Bernstein. There really should be a harp in that number. But then Bernstein reviewed with me, page by page, this score that I had put together. And then I produced a set of hand-copied parts for it. And then we had a full day with the London Symphony. Justin Brown was hired to be assistant conductor, running through all the material with just the orchestra to see if there were any problems. And there were a couple wrong notes, but it worked. It was great. I also made sure all the singers had their, every number, including the 26 additional bars he reinstated into the auto da fe. Excellent chorus, the London voices, beautifully prepared. And it worked. It came together really well. And it was a year after that Candide that he asked me to be his music editor. That He said that was
So your
that was
title
the
changed
test.
at that point.
Yeah,
And how long were you then music editor?
then, well, he died, so I did it for 9 years. So I worked for him for a total of 18 years. 4 years as his assistant, 3 basically to put that archive together, which was really more of an appraisal than making an archive. I mean, we didn't know what was in that apartment in the Osborne, and then a year as working on Candide, basically, and then 9 years as his music editor after his death.
Again, I'd thought a lot about him editing his scores, but I don't know, in terms of the recordings themselves, how involved he was with listening to them, editing the recordings, approving things there. What was that like? How did that work?
That, for me, that was an education because I had never attended a recording session. And it was always the same crew headed by Hans Weber from Deutsche Grammophon. And the technicians, there was kind of a rotating group of technicians, but it was basically 6 or 7 guys who were, I mean, and Lenny loved them. I mean, he just absolutely adored this crew, especially Hans Weber. But then there were these approval sessions in which the edited tapes, you know, they'd have to splice out a really bad cough from somewhere in the audience, or let's say, well, with the Vienna Philharmonic, there were some recordings that were just one take because they play perfectly, and that, you know, that happened with other orchestras too. The New York Philharmonic did that. Well, in fact, the first recording session I went to with Bernstein was at Watford Town Hall, the BBC Symphony Orchestra doing an all Elgar album, and there were these marches. The live concert was Enigma Variations and Bernstein's Songfest. And so the Enigma was taken from the live performance, but at the recording session at Watford Town Hall, the album was being filled out with Elgar marches. And I remember in the car going up to Watford, I said, how is it that this orchestra is going to just play these and record them without any rehearsal? We're doing, you know, 6 or 7 marches in one day. And Bernstein said, well, they've played these before. They know this music, and they're going to watch me. And he said, just pay attention at this recording session, and you'll see how it's done. And it was done. It was incredible. And they're good. They're fabulous recordings of those Elgar marches, of the Crown of India and Pomp and Circumstance and all those standards. But then there was still an approval session, and when there was a piece that had several performances and sometimes a little bit of retakes, the audience would sit there in the hall because the ambience had to be the same, and there would be maybe the end of one movement, just 3 or 4 bars, that Hans Weber would say, well, we heard someone shuffling in their seat or something like that. We heard a creaking seat, or you know, the second bassoon wasn't really paying attention or something like that. I'm just making things up. So there would be splices, and then there would be a listening session maybe 6 months later. And Bernstein and Hans Weber would compare notes without, I mean, neither of them had anything written, but Bernstein would say, oh, so that was the Sunday morning concert. That the end of that movement was from the Sunday morning concert, even though you used the Saturday afternoon for most of that movement. And Hans Weber would say, yes, that's exactly right. They remembered all this.
How did Lenny actually edit his scores? What was the process of
Something
going
he
through
learned
them?
from Kusevitsky was to mark the phrasing at the top of the page with a blue pencil, a curve for a 3-bar phrase, and the top of a triangle, like a gable on a house, for a 2-bar phrase. And then if it was more than more bars than that, you could draw, say in Haydn when there are 5-bar phrases, you draw the 3-bar phrase and then you put a plus 4 plus 5, and it's just a reminder. It's a conductor's note, and it's a reminder of where the music is going. You know, as though you were an actor reading a soliloquy from Shakespeare. You want to know where the phrase ends, so you can take a breath or emphasize something new. But then with red pencil, he'd mark, especially articulation, lots and lots of articulation. Sometimes just making it consistent within a score, and sometimes it was the matter of a not great edition or an older edition or the original edition. But sometimes a real change. I remember in a Mahler 9, I think, must be in the burlesque. There's an upward scale passage for almost the entire orchestra, but there's also a retard in that scale, and what Bernstein did was to alter the rhythmic notation so that the retard would happen pretty much automatically. From, let's say, equal 16th notes to let's say a triplet of 16ths with the last one tied to an 8th note, and then the orchestra would play it absolutely accurately, and then it would be that automatic change of tempo that he was looking for. And that's something that you can do in music. You don't want to tell everybody in the audience that you're doing that, but I mean, Mahler did it to Beethoven.
But how would he make those decisions? How did they evolve over time? Would he play something, conduct something one way once, and then decide that worked or that didn't?
He was constantly rethinking every piece that he conducted. And I remember at the last concert at Tanglewood when he was doing Beethoven 7, I'd never seen a conductor do this, and I've seen it now over and over, as he was rehearsing, talking to the orchestra over the music and telling them things and praising them when they did well. But for instance, in the second movement of the Beethoven 7, the winds come in at one point on a 7th chord. There's a long phrase, but there are no woodwinds, and then the winds come in on a chord that is going to resolve eventually at the end of this phrase. That was very new. Nobody did it before Beethoven. And Lenny was talking
before Beethoven.
Before Beethoven.
Oh, okay.
And so Lenny was talking to the Boston Symphony about this particular chord, and that Brahms used it, borrowed that from Beethoven, and you hear it in the Brahms symphonies. You don't hear it in Mozart or Haydn. The winds don't come in on a chord that is just going to hang there, and so what it does in the Beethoven, and all this was explained while he was conducting during the rehearsal. What it does in the Beethoven is it adds to the phrase, but the winds have to shape that second half of that phrase in such a way that it's going to help the phrase resolve. It's very beautiful. So what he got them to do, and I don't remember if he marked this in his score, but at least he told them, was the winds enter in the 7th chord. They expand the sound a little bit, and then they taper off, because then the chord resolves and everybody plays in a downward scale to the end of the phrase. And that's the sort of thing that a conductor, I mean, you really have to study a score and get the composer in the context of where he was in his career. And
Would he be reading biographies of the composer? I mean, where would he get some of the musicological background?
you know, it was mostly just from reading scores. He could, his knowledge, his perception in reading a score was phenomenal. He did read a number. I mean, he was always reading books. There were 3 book bags that went on every trip. There was an interesting biography of Robert Schumann that came out, really a psychosexual biography of Schumann by a guy named Peter Ostwald. And authors would give galleys to Bernstein, so he would get these in advance. And he expected me to read them too. Because, I mean, you know, you're going to sit in an airport changing planes and you're there for 2 hours with nothing to do. Well, you're going to have a conversation with Leonard Bernstein about Robert Schumann's sexual problems, because that's what he wanted to talk about. So I had to read the book too.
Did Lenny listen to other conductors? Would he get recordings or go to concerts, and would he ever be influenced by what they did?
Not as much as people would think. He usually, when offered, he would agree to go. There were some bad moments. Xenopoli was doing a Mahler cycle also for Deutsche Grammophon. And we were in Rome one time, and Xenopoli was doing the Mahler number 2 and with the Accademia of Santa Cecilia, and they said to Bernstein, well, you have to come hear this guy, he's fantastic. We'd never heard of him. And I didn't want to go. I was working on the orchestra material for the Beethoven Third, which was being done the following week, Bernstein with the same orchestra. And so Bernstein went to this concert, and his seat was in the middle of a row, and he realized within a minute and a half that the performance was a disaster, that the Xenopoli didn't know how to conduct Mahler. He wasn't any more specific than that, but Bernstein said he looked around and he realized he couldn't get up and leave. It would be, and there's no intermission in that piece, so he was stuck. And he came back to the hotel, and I was still up. We were in a suite where there were bedrooms at opposite ends of the suite. I didn't always share a suite. I usually had a very separate room, you know. And he saw that the light was on, and I was sitting at a little desk marking up the Beethoven Third Symphony parts, and he was furious. He was absolutely furious. He said he wasted an entire evening, and he never wanted to hear anything more about this conductor. And but usually, I mean, if he went to something, he was kind of grateful. He'd go backstage. What's his name? Wonderful British conductor. He always had a cane. A younger guy. Not Davis? No. I can't remember his name. Bernstein would go backstage and you know, be worshipful usually, but not with someone like Xenopoli. I can say Xenopoli because he died, and his Mahler symphonies didn't sell very well.
This may be a naive question, but I've been involved in theater where a director will have the actors experiment with things, try things. Does a conductor ever do that? Say, let's see what happens if you do this, or there's not that kind of give and take with the...
Well, not with Bernstein, especially not in the last 8 years that I knew him of his life. He really knew what he wanted. He may have done that when he was at the Philharmonic, There were some experimental programs. In fact, Jack Gottlieb and I would talk about that occasionally, because Jack was Bernstein's assistant during some of those Philharmonic years. And Bernstein did tell me that at one concert with the Philharmonic, it was all very new experimental stuff, and there was no applause. And he didn't know how to get off the stage. And so he finally just put his baton down and slunk off.
How much did he try and find new works?
Well, he didn't have to do much, because there were upwards of 24 scores arriving every week at his apartment.
Would he read through them, though?
No, that was part of my job, was to sift through them, and if I felt something was worthy, to put it on his desk. And I'd say every year maybe 3 works. Sometimes it was a famous name and I felt obligated. He did ask, though, for instance, when Peter Maxwell Davies wrote his 8th symphony, he said he wanted to look at it. Oh, I know, we had the Fires of London, that was Max Davies' group, came to New York. Bernstein had never heard the Fires of London. He knew what they were. And I got a pair of tickets. I had met Max Davies a number of years before. He was doing a U.S. tour with Perrault Lunaire and a couple other works. And I met Max Davies because when I lived in Boston, I shared an apartment, and my roommate had been a pupil of Davies. So we went to this. I got tickets. There was a premiere by Elliott Carter that night, and so Bernstein met Davies, and he was very impressed. I mean, he thought, yeah, this guy's the real thing. Although at a reception, at the party afterwards, off in a corner, I saw Bernstein, Ned Rorem, Elliott Carter, and Max Davies talking to one another, and they didn't look very happy. And I thought I would go over there and see if anybody needed a refresher for their drinks. And what they were discussing was how they had lost their looks. And I thought, this incredible congruence of talent of 20th century musicians, and that's what they were talking about. So I got some scores of Davies from Boosey and Hawkes, but Bernstein never conducted any of them.
Was it awkward for him, friends who were composers like David Diamond, that they would want him to look at their works or conduct them, and he would have to say no?
Well, it depended on who it was. One album that Bernstein did with the New York Philharmonic that I helped out on, but it was after I had stopped being his assistant, was a David Del Tredici and Ned Rorem album. And Ned's piece was for violin and orchestra, and it's a suite. I can't remember what the title is. And Bernstein decided to reorder the suite. And Ned didn't like that he did that, but what are you going to do? It's a recording by the New York Philharmonic. It's going to help publicize the suite. And I think eventually, well, they stayed friends. I mean, they weren't going to break up, it wasn't going to break up their friendship. But I think eventually Bernstein came around and said, yeah, you were right, the original order was better. And he did a terrific recording of the David Del Tredici piece. I think it could have been Dumb Tweedle. No, it was a piece that wasn't connected to the Alice books. But also they would, all these composers that he'd known Rorem since I think the 1940s. David Del Tredici, I can't remember when they would have met. And David Diamond, of course, they knew one another all their lives. So he was always in touch with them, and they would always send their scores, or a recording and a score. I remember when the first of the Alice pieces of Del Tredici arrived, and that afternoon, Lenny put on the album and followed through the score. And I wasn't, this was up in Connecticut. I was doing something else, and later that evening, Bernstein said, "Well, you really should listen to this thing and look at the score. You know, you'll learn something." And I couldn't really get into it.
Was he ever concerned that other people's music that he was conducting and listening to might inadvertently influence his own writing, or that never?
Well, there was this other problem he had when he conducted Mahler. For instance, it was very hard to get the Mahler out of his head and get back to what he considered Bernstein. But I don't think the influence. I think his somehow how he had learned music composition was so accurate in some way of pinpointing what was his personality. I think this is something he learned from Copland, and Copland learned it from Nadia Boulanger. That Copland had said that when he first went to Boulanger, I can't remember the piece he had, he'd written something, and she'd say, "Well, these 2 bars, that's you, so we need more of that." You know, and there would be 40 other pages that were, you know, she'd say, "No, that doesn't mean anything." And there was some correspondence between Copland and Bernstein, because everything that Bernstein wrote after he'd met Copland, he would share with Copland, and Copland would do the same thing. I think what was the piece? Maybe Jeremiah went through that process. I think there is some correspondence here that helps illustrate that. And Copland did the same thing. He'd say, "Well, this section is you, but all this other stuff, that's somebody else." And that when you have a good instructor or a good mentor when you're young enough, that really does focus your compositional skill.
When he was working on A Quiet Place, how much of it was setting text, and did that was he concerned about the natural flow of language, the rhythm and the pitches of language, or they were separate?
The language, he and Stephen had this, I don't want to say agenda, but they definitely wanted to do an American opera in the vernacular, the way people actually speak. So there are all kinds of interruptions, and people interrupting one another and people interrupting themselves. There was a big discussion one week about whether they could use the F word in an opera, and in fact, it is. The F word appears in A Quiet Place. So there was that aspect. There was the conscious setting of an American vernacular. Musically, I didn't know it at the time, but Bernstein constantly recycled music that he had written for pieces that either never took off or were abandoned in some way or other. So in A Quiet Place, I think there are segments that had been written for a musical version of the Nabokov book Lolita that he was going to write with Edward Albee. I think most of A Quiet Place, though, is newly composed. Harmonically, it's based on the harmonic language of Trouble in Tahiti with a little bit more abstraction. And one evening, he finished one of the interludes. This was up in Connecticut. There were these interludes between the acts. and he wanted to play it at the piano, but he needed 2 extra hands. And I was up, I was reading, it was around 3 in the morning. And so he asked me to sit at the piano with him and play this thing. And he explained to me I sat there and I did what I could. We got better, we played it about 10 times. I got better, he played perfectly. But he explained to me how out of the harmonic language that he was using for A Quiet Place, and there was a different harmonic language for certain other pieces. Dybbuk is a great example of a harmonic structure that out of which the entire piece comes. There are these scales and chord combinations that are it's not like serialism because it's more there's more emotion involved in that, and more about what can be caught by the listener. I think serialism is not so much about listening, but it's just how it looks on the page. But with A Quiet Place, he was explaining how out of the harmony he derives the melodic contours that he wants. And of course it's based on the emphasis in speech and rhythms. And the rhythms had to be exactly what a vernacular rhythm would be. And it was quite an instruction. And so that's really what A Quiet Place does. It puts the vernacular
Was there
into
a tension with him of wanting to do something musically and at the same time wanting to do the vernacular, and they would ever be in conflict? Or?
I think for him that was the way he always had wanted to compose. And that I think his first stab at that was probably Trouble in Tahiti. But actually, I think a really good example of that is Wonderful Town. I think Wonderful Town is very vernacular, even though it's got some, what's a song like A Quiet Girl, which was actually written for a lullaby
Right.
for Jamie, it's very singerly, but it still works as a kind of vernacular number. I mean, it's never stilted. You never think, well, the emphasis in the... Well, there is something that Sondheim talks about when Somewhere from West Side Story has always been known as the song. But for me, the syllable leads to something else, place. But it is the
Was it
high
something
note.
Lenny ever talked about? Was he self-conscious about that at all, or?
No, I actually never talked to him about. I didn't talk. I had never even seen West Side Story when I worked for him. I'd never seen the film. My mother wouldn't let me go see it. And
You'd heard the score.
I'd heard 2 numbers from it because when I was a teenager, I bought an album that said highlights of Broadway from whatever year in the 50s. And so the Jet Song and America were on this album. It was one of those composite albums with cuts from various original cast albums. And I love the Jet Song because it didn't sound like show music to me. It sounded completely other. And talk about vernacular. I mean, that's wonderfully vernacular. But I didn't know the show at all. And the first time I saw it, I sat next to Bernstein at the. I mean, I was his assistant. I had to sit next to him at a London revival, '84, I think, maybe '85. It was a wonderful production. Tommy Abbott, who had been guitar in the original, was who had recreated the choreography. And Bernstein, as he always did, talked all the way through the performance. I didn't take notes, but I remember what he said. It was like a private master class, and it just happened to be his biggest, his splashiest piece. It was an unforgettable evening. Mostly he would say things like, when the conductor would speed up too much. He'd put his hand, Bernstein would put his hand like he was putting the brake on or something like that. And he told the conductor afterwards to trust the music more.
What about working with a choreographer in terms of the music?
Yeah, I don't, in the years I worked for him, there wasn't any choreography. I don't think that there was any. And I didn't know anything about ballet or dance at all. And he was horrified that I'd never really been to a ballet. I think I saw one ballet when I lived in Naples. Ballet has never really interested me that much. Well, for one thing, the music tends to be pretty silly. You go to Don Quixote, the Petipa production, and it's music by Minkus that really is ridiculous. So what Bernstein started doing when I would have a free night, and he knew that there would be a Robbins revival at City Ballet, he would call up and get me a ticket and insist that I go. And then after the performance, I had to go back to the Dakota and talk to Bernstein about what I saw. How did it work with the music? Because when there was an interesting revival, Bernstein himself would often go, especially if Robbins was touching up, the making sure that the dancers really were following his instructions. And he said that for Stars and Stripes, Robbins invited him up onto the catwalk above the stage, and so they watched the performance from up in the catwalk, and he said it's a dazzling way to look at how a choreographer thinks about placement on the stage. He said you just can't believe how it changes how you look at dance. I said, well, lucky for you. That's terrific. So the first thing I got to see of Robbins was the Debussy Prelude to an Afternoon that takes place in a dance studio. Mm-hmm. I just didn't know what to make of it. So I went back to the Dakota and I said, well, here's what I liked, because I had learned long ago when giving a criticism, you say 3 good things, and then you can say whatever you want about what you didn't like, but you have to start with 3 good things. And I don't remember.
With Lenny or just in general?
In general.
Okay.
I would never give criticism without saying 3 good things. And if I couldn't think of 3 things, I'd say, well, I just can't say anything. And so we talked for about an hour about this particular ballet of Robbins. And Bernstein knew it backwards and forwards, and he understood exactly what Robbins was trying to do and what all the names were of all the classical movements. And
did he have a photographic memory?
the visuals for him were kind of strange because he didn't know anything about painting. When we were in Madrid one time, and we had a 12 o'clock flight to Barcelona. He got up early the day we were leaving, and he said, we were at the Ritz, which is the back garden goes right to the Prado. And he said, do we have time to go over to the Prado before we get in the car? And I said, yeah, we can go. But I said, I'm going to take you to one painting. And the Las Meninas, the handmaidens of Velázquez, was in a separate room at that time. I think it had just been cleaned. So I took him in there, and he didn't know what he was looking at. And I explained, I'd read all kinds of essays about this painting, and I explained who everybody was and how the painting was organized, and colors and structure and light, and he was really fascinated. But he'd never even thought about that in terms of looking at a painting. So it was odd. But he loved dance. I don't know what the big draw was, though. He loved talking to Robbins about choreography. But while I was working for him, there wasn't anything that was choreographed.
When he was both composing and conducting, did he work at a piano? Or to what degree did he?
Conducting was only at a desk.
So he wouldn't go and see if there was an inner line to.
No,
or to
very, very, very rarely. No, and he really didn't have to rely on a piano for that. For composing, it was a mix. It was Fairfield was the perfect setup. His house in Connecticut, where he had the grand piano, a big flat desk. I mean, you could put. Well, the paper was pretty much 11 by 17, but you could put 4 pieces of paper. And then a stand-up desk, like something like what Thomas Jefferson had, with an angle very long, 6 or 8 feet long, so you could put page after page next to one another. And I was thinking of that yesterday when I was looking at manuscripts here. It's very easy to tell for me when something was written at the piano. There's a kind of shakiness. It looks more like an older guy's script, but it isn't necessarily that he was older. He was just writing like this at the piano, and then go to the flat desk to make the fair copy, rewrite it completely from start to finish. But that was only when he was sure that he had a segment that was a real entity. And the stand-up desk was further corrections or making yet another copy. Sometimes there would be 2 fair copies of the same piece. There would be an insert, and then he would want to put that in. Although when I was looking at Dybbuk yesterday, there were an awful lot of inserts that simply got, it's the next page, and you have to know to go to that page and then come back. And then some of the paper that he was using was this fold. What do you call that when it's two pages that are folded together? Not a fold. Well, maybe it is called a folio. And then one of those folded pages would become the folder for that number. And every piece he wrote is in discrete numbers, and then on the front of the folder you put whatever the title is, or if it doesn't have a title, it's just where it goes in the larger work, and everything for that number goes into that folder. Any little envelope on which he's written thoughts or a change in lyrics or something like that, it goes into that folder. And so all of his works were organized in that way. But that's all done piano and desk. Conducting was completely other.
The collection, as you know, is so huge. How much of it was saved because of his own sense of posterity, or was it because of Helen Coates? Was it a combination? Was it, and not the music manuscripts, sort of course, but the fact that they saved all the fan mail, or...
I never talked to him about the posterity aspect. Helen probably felt that weight of posterity. I think she must have recognized, even from the very first piano lesson that he had with her, that this was a talent that would actually go somewhere. And she certainly saved every piece of fan mail. I had the feeling that Bernstein saved his manuscripts so that he could refer to them later. And
did he do that you saw?
Yeah, there were, especially with A Quiet Place, there were previous manuscripts that he would want to look at, and then there would be little individual numbers. There was a number about, he wrote I wouldn't call it a cabaret song, but a kind of a throwaway song called I Wish I Had Never Gone to That Party. And I couldn't find it. He asked me what happened to this song he had written, and I never found it. It actually may be here, but that's beyond what I can look at. But he liked to have these things kept track of, because rather than write them out from memory again, it was just useful to have as a reference.
But there was an ego there.
Yeah, but we never talked about the posterity aspect.
Somebody once said to me he suffered from importantitis.
Well, it's true that everything he uttered he felt was going to be earth-shattering, of great importance, and that people should pay attention to what he was. But then he thought consciously before he would say things, although he never went on to Cavett or any of those talk shows because he was afraid he would put his foot in his mouth, say something that he would be misunderstood. Not that he hadn't intended, but that would be misunderstood.
And he actually verbalized that to you, that's why he didn't do it.
Yes, that's why he didn't do it. He never went on a talk show. Plus, his language was a little colorful, and it just would have been bleeped out, and that would have been embarrassing. I mean, back then, a series of bleeps, people would have turned off their TVs.
But it's an interesting self-awareness to have that.
He also, he liked to be carefully prepared. Everything he did was actually carefully. He was a student all his life. He really studied scores that he was going to conduct. When he had to give a speech, it went through 7 drafts. The young people's concerts is an enormous amount of preparation for each script. That was all about being prepared.
As he got older, you talked about even the very first time you met him, he sort of seemed, from what I can tell, to have become somewhat dissolute, and did that not influence the other? Was he able to compartmentalize? And
yeah, there was definitely that ability to shift gears. It was pretty remarkable how he was able to do that. Dissolute, yeah, there was definitely some dissolution. Sometimes a self-indulgence that veered into being out of control.
Was there self-awareness about that? Was there embarrassment? Would he try and then rein himself in, or?
I don't think he understood what was necessary. For instance, at the end of the first year that I worked for him, he wasn't sleeping. He'd taken a lot of for me, it looked like a lot of Dexedrine over that year. And it was something older guys did in the 70s and 80s. They took Dexedrine for energy. I don't think anybody, I don't know if anybody does that now, but it definitely keeps you awake. And he wasn't getting any sleep. So Harry Kraut looked into a sleep disorder clinic. And over one particular weekend in November of '82, Bernstein went to the Montefiore sleep-wake disorder clinic. And it was discovered he had what is actually a pretty normal sleep pattern of 7 hours and then 17 hours awake. But he never learned about preparing for the 7 hours of sleep. A couple drinks before dinner, a big, not necessarily a rich meal, but a fairly big meal at the end of the day, a chocolate bar just before going to bed. He didn't drink after dinner particularly, and he didn't drink much with dinner. And then, a midnight phone call from his sister Shirley. Whenever he was on the phone, he had to smoke a cigarette. So he'd have 3 or 4 cigarettes while on the phone with Shirley discussing crossword puzzles. Then his brain would be going, a million miles a minute, finishing the crossword puzzle in The Guardian, and being hyped up from having smoked a few cigarettes. And it would be 2 in the morning, and then he would say, I'm not tired, so I'm going to stay up and I'm going to work on this piece of music. And on some pieces, he wrote the time of day when, if he got to a double bar line, he'd write the time of day. I think Puccini did this also. And it's often 3 or 4 a.m. Well, and then go to bed.
But why? What was the importance of marking the time?
Oh, it was just keeping track, I think. Although for me, a piece he gave me called 1 Minute for Charlie, I think it's 3:10 a.m. at the double bar at the end. I think it was to show, see, I stayed up all night writing this for you. But and then realized that it was late, and if he had a commitment the next day, he was going to have to get up at some point. So how was he going to fall asleep? Well, you take a sleeping pill, but if you take it 15 minutes before you go to bed, it doesn't take effect for an hour. So he's up for an hour, and then ends up sleeping until 2 in the afternoon. It was ridiculous.
Would he miss appointments and things?
No, but there was, the first time I was at Tanglewood with him, he would tell me, I would wake him up, let's say at 8 in the morning, and he'd say, oh, cross out the 10 a.m. I said, I'll make the 1 o'clock conducting class, but that thing at 10 a.m., just cross it out. So I'd call Richard Ortner and say, well, we're not going to be there at 10 o'clock for whatever the heck it was, but we'll be at Saranac at 1 in the afternoon. And he regretted doing that. It got worse as the years went on. But it was just, he never really put it all together in terms of how you prepare to go to sleep.
Did you ever try and explain any of these things to him, or
no? Because I wasn't a medical professional, and he needed to talk to someone who was a professional. So the doctor at the sleep-wake clinic got him to adjust to this schedule. It was mayhem for several weeks because we were moving his schedule, I think, 2 hours a day, so that it would eventually be that he would go to sleep at something like 1 in the morning, but then be up by 8 o'clock, and the next day. But to get to that meant that we were moving the schedule, and he well, of course, it was all about him. So he loved that he was doing this, and we were all, his whole household staff was involved in this. It would be 9 o'clock at night. He would be getting up because we were moving the schedule for him, and he'd come downstairs in Connecticut and say to Julia, the housekeeper, I'm ready for a bowl of oatmeal. And she'd say, of course, senor, and make him a bowl of oatmeal at 9, whereas we had just finished dinner. So the goal was that by Thanksgiving in November of '82, he would be on a normal schedule. And it worked. It worked for about 2 months. And then he just didn't pay any attention to it. He went back to his old habits. Oh, and he also had to keep track, just like with smoke enders, he had to keep track of how he felt across the course of the day, whether he felt like he needed a nap, was he indulging in sugar or alcohol or anything like that.
This was for his doctor? Or?
Yeah, for the sleep. Well, for the sleep disorder doctor, not for his normal doctor.
To what degree did he? I mean, faith seems to have been such an important part of his work and all that. But did he go to shul regularly? Did he do religious things, or that was just an internal thing?
There were, one of the first things he told me was that on Friday evening, he would call his mother. And it didn't matter where we were or what was going on, he had to call his mother every Friday. And that to me, that meant something. But no, one Yom Kippur, we were in London, and so he was invited to the Marble Arch Synagogue, and he went. I was really grateful because then I had a free night. And the next night we went to that performance of West Side Story. So I was recovered enough so that I could actually pay attention. I never went with him to any temple. But I also remember that in Girona, Spain, there was a couple, oh, I don't remember their names. They were researching a very ancient Jewish presence in Catalonia, and they had found the remnants of a synagogue, and Bernstein went to visit them and got very emotional about the Jewish connection in that part of Spain. And there are photos somewhere of him praying in this kind of subterranean chamber. I wasn't with him on that trip.
Did he believe in God? Did he believe in an afterlife? Did he?
I don't think he did, but that would be conjecture on my part. Strangely enough, I think the place where he was least religious was Israel. He kind of chafed. One time we were flying from, we were taking the Israel Philharmonic to the May Festival in Florence, Italy. And in order to get to Florence for a Saturday evening performance, we had to leave Israel sometime on Friday. But it wasn't clear that we could all get to the hotels in Florence before sunset on Friday. So the members of the Israel Philharmonic came up to Lenny individually and said, it's not me, it's everybody else in the orchestra who won't fly on Friday after sunset. And after about the 10th person confessing this, Lenny said, we'll get a dispensation. And in fact, the orchestra did get a special dispensation from the Grand Rabbi of Rome. He wasn't interested in the religious rules that were going to interfere with getting a performance done. A trip followed by a performance. That was I thought that was a pretty amusing dilemma.
Did he fear death? Would he talk about that?
His one phrase that started appearing, I think in the third year I was working for him, was, the maestro said just before he died. He'd be telling me to do something, and then he'd stick in a joke. I mean, there were constant jokes. So everything was. If I didn't have a new joke every day, then he wasn't going to pay any attention to me.
You had to collect jokes for him?
Oh yeah, they're written in a kind of a shorthand in the back of my date books. Anytime I heard a new joke, I wrote it down, and then what I learned to do was whenever he told me a joke, I would retell it immediately, and try to embellish it, because you always had to embellish whatever, so that this repertoire of jokes became just part of daily conversation. But yes, absolutely, there had to be new jokes all the time. Yes, so after a joke he would say, and then the maestro said just before he died, and that was supposed to be funny. It was an indication that he was feeling mortal, I think. He also began singing, and this was, I remember the first time he sang this, something that I had learned as a little kid. Where will we be in 100 years from now? Pushing up the daisies, pushing up the daisies. Chopin's Funeral March, I mean, that's pretty
Were there things
morbid.
he desperately wanted to accomplish before he died, that you had a sense there was a...
Yeah, there was an opera based on the Holocaust. I think that would have been interesting. And he really did want to do that.
Why didn't it happen?
There was collaboration. The collaboration never came together. He really wanted to record Mikado.
Really?
Yeah, it would have been wonderful. Deutsche Grammophon didn't know what it was, basically. I used to poke fun at the bigwigs at Deutsche Grammophon, Yes, for Mikado we will have that famous soprano for Yum Yum, Birgit Nielsen. He wanted to record Otello. He wanted to do Don Carlos at the Escorial, filmed by Zeffirelli. That would have been a very exciting project. It just never came together. And Zeffirelli got very excited about it.
How much power did Deutsche Grammophon have, or how much did he have with them?
That was a Harry Kraut question. I don't know. They seemed to dictate the repertory that they wanted. I mean, they had actually scheduled Elijah of Mendelssohn for 1991, and it didn't happen, obviously. But Elijah? I mean, gosh, there's so much else to record.
Could he say no?
I don't think he ever did. I'm not aware that he ever said no. I was after him. The Vienna Philharmonic wanted to do Histoire du Soldat, and they wanted to do a really interesting program, especially interesting for them. Histoire du Soldat and maybe the Grand Partita of Mozart for winds, and God, there was a third piece, maybe for Clairtenacht, I can't remember. It was a really interesting program, and for them, very, very off the wall. I mean, the Vienna Philharmonic just doesn't do Stravinsky. He got excited about that, but you can't get the recording company behind it. It's just not going to happen. Yeah, the Otello and the Mikado were important to him.
You just reminded me the story you had told me about the date books, and I don't know if it's in your memoir. So if it's not, I want to get it down. That you would put in the schedules in advance so he would see,
right?
But then he would write in.
Yes, I always put in every concert with every piece, and the time and the hall, because he looked at his date book every day. In fact, after Bloomington, Indiana, we got back to New York, and I decided I would continue with the job. The first day in New York, he said, the first thing you have to do when you get to the apartment every day is look at my date book, because he would be on the phone at 2 a.m. and agree to go have dinner with somebody, and he'd write it in his date book. Everything was very carefully notated in his date book. But then what I would do, once I got a tour schedule, or let's say we were going to Vienna for 2 weeks, I would write in all the concerts, any press events that I knew about, or anything like that. And when we did a tour with the Bavarian Radio Symphony, we went to Budapest, Zagreb, and Ljubljana. There were supposed to be encores, but they hadn't been settled on. Eventually, he did 2 numbers from his Divertimento. He did the Turkey Trot and the Waltz and the Turkey Trot as encores. So at the bottom of each program, I just wrote encore, : and he decided to write in the most stultifying pieces he could think of, well, the most ridiculous encores. Something by John Cage. I can't remember the title. It was a piece of John Cage's I had never heard of. Well, you would never do John Cage as an encore. After the Schumann Second Symphony, I mean, really, and Bartók music for strings, percussion, and celeste. Yeah, do a piece by John Cage. Another encore was the Meditation from Thais of Massenet.
So these were just to amuse you.
Yeah, and no one else was ever going to see what was in his date book. the third concert he wrote in his encore, Ravel, Daphnis, and Chloe, full ballet.
But so researchers now looking at his date books will think these are the encores he performed.
Exactly,
so-
and I think that's hilarious. So you'd have to go to the actual concert programs. I don't know if the encores ever got printed in those programs, but yeah, I thought that was actually pretty funny. And I hadn't really noticed those until 4 years ago, and I was looking at those date books again, and I saw those encore spoofs as they were. I was pretty amused. But that was a wonderful tour.
When he talked with his mother Friday nights, how long would the conversations last, and what would they talk about?
Probably 15 to 30 minutes. She would say, have you stopped smoking? And I talked to her a couple times a week. After I met her, we talked pretty constantly. Yeah. And if we got someplace, let's say we got to Vienna and we hadn't really been in touch with anybody for a few days, sometimes I would call Shirley, especially if Shirley, his sister, would be up in Connecticut. I would just call her there. And she was always very grateful to hear that. But to call Jenny, that was special. And we would talk about, I would tell her where we were and what we were doing, and she'd say, well, how is he cutting back on the cigarettes? You know, what can we do to get him to stop smoking? And I just have to say, well, I'm not sure that I can do anything. And of course I sent postcards, and if I saw something that I thought she would like, I would send it to her. One time in Key West, we sent, this was Patty Pulliam's idea, we went to a tropical fruit market, and we packed up a box of, star fruit and mangoes and papayas and passion fruit and all kinds of stuff, and grapefruit, and shipped it by air to Jenny in Boston, and she loved getting stuff like that. I don't think she could eat all of that.
Did Lenny know you were doing these things?
I think he was a little surprised how much I was in touch with his mother, and if he came in at the Dakota, if he came into the office and I was on the phone with her, he wouldn't interrupt, but afterwards he would say, well, now, what were you talking about? And I said, well, how to get you to stop smoking. He didn't want to hear that. And then after I quit being his assistant, I went up to Boston periodically. Whenever there was a new CD out, I would go up to Boston. I'd take Jenny and her sisters out for lunch, give her the CD, organize what she had. And one day she called me and she said, you know that clothes hamper that's at the foot of my bed? I couldn't really remember. She said, well, I was emptying it the other day. I decided I should take everything out of it. And you know what I found? I found the score of Jeremiah. And I said, oh, come on. And she said, yeah, it's always been in there. And she said, I think you should have this. Yeah, okay, that's a good idea. So I flew up there the next day, and sure enough, it was the manuscript of, I guess, just of Lamentation that he'd submitted to a composition contest, and she had kept it and forgotten that she'd put it in the bottom of her clothes hamper.
For years.
Oh, decades. But I was so grateful, because I had this friendship with her that she felt she wasn't embarrassed about it in particular, but she knew that at that point that it had some value and that somebody should have it, somebody should take it off her hands, and I was the one.
And how often did Lenny talk to Shirley?
Oh, it was every night.
Really?
Yeah. Especially about crossword puzzles, and about other things. I mean, they would also Shirley had the roster of jokes, the repertoire of jokes, new jokes, and also about show business and other things, just gossip
Would he
about
talk
show
to
business.
Burton much, or?
Yeah, there was a lot of conversation with BB, as he's called. Not as much as with Shirley, because with Shirley it was really about the crossword puzzles, and the puzzles in Harper's and the Atlantic, and also just plain gossip.
The focus on games and jokes, he didn't think of them as time away from more important things, or?
No, they were almost like jump-starting the imagination sometimes. But also the joke-telling had a kind of rabbinical quality to it, because if he told a joke, especially if there was a new person in a particular group, he would tell the joke and then point to the one person who hadn't said anything and say, now you retell it. And there was one very complicated joke. I'm not going to tell it now, but it deals with a guy with a cleft palate. It's not derogatory, but it's you have to imitate someone with a cleft palate. But it's complicated. It's really complicated. And you have to pay attention when the joke is being told, and it actually is pretty funny at the end. But then he would turn to the person who was, shy and make them retell it. And inevitably it would be all screwed up. And then he would insist on, no. All right, I'll tell it again, and then you're going to retell it. And I've saw people burst into tears because they couldn't get this. And then when you're put on the spot, of course, it makes it worse. But it was all part of being a teacher.
Was there an aspect of cruelty to it?
He really did it for love more than anything else, and also for someone who was shy and not going to participate in whatever the camaraderie was around a table. It was trying to get that person included. Also about using your imagination, paying attention, remembering something, really understanding how a joke or how a story was structured. He was really always interested in how people tell stories and how thinking and language come together. One year, I think it was the Library of Congress, printed up a calendar illustrated with Judaica that was from the collection, and the library sent Bernstein this calendar, and he was very impressed by it. And I remember looking through it with Bernstein, and I said, Jack would love to have this. And he signed it and wrote a note for Jack, and Jack called me. He was in tears. He was so thrilled to have that, because they really did discuss their shared heritage quite a bit.
Okay.
Excuse me.
I guess in closing, just, your thoughts about your time with Lenny and how that affected you, and, in retrospect now, if your feeling about him changed over time, your sense of his progression at the end.
Well, I wish that I had appreciated more. I wish that the job hadn't been so grueling. The last time we were on a Concorde together, as he was sitting down, he said, he was obviously picking a fight. He said, "You've never said anything good about my Mass." And I said, well, I've never seen Mass. I know the album, but I've never seen it performed, and I shouldn't really I can't have an opinion until I've seen a production. And spent the whole flight. He really wanted to argue. And I tried to steer it around to what he felt worked in it and what didn't work. And I remember sitting there thinking, you know, I should be very flattered that he's having this discussion with me, because who gets to talk to a composer of this stature about a particular work? Now, I just didn't know enough about Mass to have an interesting discussion. I was more interested in why he wanted to pick a fight. He was in a real foul mood. And I just wish that I hadn't been so exhausted all the time from the job, because it would have been a lot more fun to think of him more as a colleague or as a mentor. And I didn't think of him that way when I was working for him.
Do you think he ever thought of you as a friend, or?
Eventually, I took a month off. Let's see, that was after A Quiet Place at La Scala, and Harry gave me the entire month of July of '84 off. And I came back to the States. I stayed for a few weeks in Italy, and I came back to the States. And the production was at the Kennedy Center in July of '84. And I wanted to see one performance at the Kennedy Center. So I called the Watergate Hotel, and I was put through to Harry's room, and I said, I'm just calling to see how things are. And Harry invited me over and said, well, come up to Lenny's suite, and you can say hello. And I did, and Harry was sitting at the end of a table, and Bernstein and I were sitting at the other end at a corner. And we just carried on with jokes and all kinds of just interesting chit-chat. And Harry said later, I couldn't get a word in. And it was the first time I'd come in to meet with Bernstein after a long break, and it was like a friend visiting him. And it was what I had seen for a couple years. When I remember the first time in Washington, the first Bernstein friend to come by was Roger Wilkins. And it was exactly that. He came in and he sat down. I mean, they hugged and he sat down, and Roger Wilkins had just published his memoir at that point. And I was just astonished at at this friendly banter that Bernstein could have with just about anybody under the sun. And that was the first time I actually had that feeling for myself. I thought, well, how sweet. This could really be an interesting guy to know. But then, of course, I went back into being the assistant for another year and a half, and I should have quit.
But
at
he
that
wrote
point.
pieces of music for you and poems, and I mean, he wouldn't do that. Was that extraordinary, or?
No, there were quite a few people who got pieces of music and poems, and they were always very genuine, and they took some thought on his point. However, the piece of music with my name in the title, he didn't want it published in the last group of piano anniversaries because he said the middle part of the piece doesn't go anywhere. And I remember saying, well, thanks a lot. It's not random, but it's a series of chords, and he's right, it doesn't really go anywhere. It has been recorded, actually. I'm not sure that Boozy has ever published the printed music, but yeah, so there's a little bit of regret, but at the same time, one very good friend, I guess after Bernstein died, asked me if working for him had changed my life, and I said not so much a change, but the various aspects of what I had always found compelling, music and language, and using the imagination, being able to think musically and think. I mean, the reason why I went to Carnegie Mellon in architecture was because I've never had a problem. It's so easy for me to imagine interiors and exteriors and spaces and volumes just in my head. I think it's from having lived overseas and visiting, 1,000 different cathedrals and castles and palaces and so forth, and you just begin to think in this way, in the history of architecture and the history of music and all that stuff that I find so compelling. And so with Bernstein, it was the first time all of this could come together and actually be useful, and I could talk to someone who spoke to me as an adult, and who had interesting thoughts, even though he really seemed to know nothing about the history of painting. But he did understand certain aspects of architecture. And in terms of music, I mean, I've never spoken to anybody else who was so articulate and who really understood it from the inside out. So that was extraordinary. But whether that was a change in my life, I don't really think so. It certainly made me into a more articulate person and a better thinker. But I don't know, I still haven't really grown up, so it's not, that's not really a change. But I wouldn't say apotheosis, but it's a good sort of summary feeling that I got from him.
Well, at a good summary feeling, I think that's an appropriate time to end.
And it's all there in my memoir. And
soon to be published by?
Oh yes, Charles Bridge, distributed by Random House, and it should be out in March of 2018. And the more I think about it, the more I would like it to be, like War and Peace. It should just be enormous. But focusing will really help. And the hardest thing, though, is to get Bernstein to come to life on the page. It's just impossible. It's really impossible. So it's my effort. Anyway, it's my contribution to the centenary.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.